10 days, not a single word spoken. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden spent 10 days in the Vietnamese jungle with the Australian SAS, and for the entire duration of that patrol, those Aussie operators communicated exclusively through hand signals and touch. No whispers, no radio chatter beyond the absolute minimum, no sound whatsoever except the jungle itself. When Hayden returned to his SEAL Team 1 unit, he told fellow operators he had learned more about reconnaissance in those 10 silent days than in any training course he'd ever attended. And Hayden wasn't some rookie. This was a man who'd been through Army Ranger School, Raider School, and every elite training program the U.S. military could throw at him. But what he witnessed in that jungle fundamentally changed his understanding of what silence could accomplish in warfare. The Viet Cong had a name for the Australian SAS. They called them Ma Rung, which translates to phantoms of the jungle or jungle ghosts. Not soldiers, not warriors. Ghosts, because that's what they seemed like to the enemy fighters who encountered them, or more accurately, who never encountered them until it was far too late. You're about to discover why the most sophisticated enemy in the Vietnam War, fighters who had mastered every conceivable form of jungle warfare, who had defeated the French and were giving the Americans hell, lived in genuine terror of an enemy they could never hear coming, and why American military doctrine would spend the next 5 decades trying and largely failing to replicate what the Australians accomplished with nothing more than perfect silence and absolute patience. The sound that kills noise is survival in the jungle. That's what every soldier learned within their first week in Vietnam. The jungle is never quiet. Insects create a constant background drone. Birds call out warnings. Monkeys crash through the canopy. Leaves rustle in the perpetual breeze. Water drips from 1,000 surfaces. The jungle is alive with sound, and in that environment, the human ear becomes finely tuned to detect anything that doesn't belong. A metallic click, the scrape of canvas against bark, the distinctive sound of a boot breaking a twig, a cough, a whispered command, the crackle of a radio transmission. American units moving through the Vietnamese jungle created an unmistakable acoustic signature. The jingle of dog tags, the metallic rattle of ammunition in magazines, the whisper of nylon against itself, the grunt of effort as men climbed terrain, the inevitable curses when someone tripped or got caught on wait-a-minute vines, radio operators constantly checking in with base, their transmissions creating brief bursts of static that carried further than most people realized, platoon leaders calling out instructions in hushed tones that were anything but quiet in the acoustic environment of triple canopy jungle. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army learned to hunt American units by sound alone. They didn't need to see the enemy. They could hear them coming from hundreds of meters away. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors announced insertions hours before troops hit the ground. The noise of American patrols moving through the bush gave enemy observers plenty of time to either set up ambushes or fade into the jungle before contact could be made. In this environment, noise didn't just compromise tactical advantage. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The Australian SAS operated under a completely different philosophy. They understood something fundamental that American doctrine had never quite grasped. In the jungle, silence wasn't just an advantage. It was the ultimate weapon. If the enemy couldn't hear you, they didn't know you existed. And if they didn't know you existed, you controlled everything. When you moved, where you positioned yourself, when you struck, when you vanished. Complete silence transformed 5 men into something that might as well have been supernatural. It made them into the very ghosts that the Viet Cong named them. The evolution of silence. The Australian approach to silence didn't emerge from Vietnam. It was forged in an earlier conflict that most people have never heard of. From 1963 to 1966, Australian SAS squadrons operated in Borneo during what was euphemistically called the Indonesian confrontation. This was Britain and Australia's quiet war against Indonesian expansion, fought in some of the most unforgiving jungle terrain on Earth. Borneo's rainforests made Vietnam's triple canopy look like a park. Visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. The humidity was so intense that metal rusted within days, and any cut or scrape became infected within hours. And in this environment, Australian SAS patrols conducted secret cross-border operations deep into Indonesian territory, sometimes spending weeks behind enemy lines with zero support and zero possibility of extraction if things went wrong. It was in Borneo that Australian SAS operators learned the hard lessons about noise discipline that would serve them so well in Vietnam. They learned that in dense jungle, sound carried in unpredictable ways. A conversation conducted in what seemed like a reasonable whisper could be heard clearly from 50 meters away under the right atmospheric conditions. The click of a weapon being made ready could alert an enemy sentry from 20 meters. Even breathing too loudly could compromise a position if enemy forces were close enough. They developed techniques that seemed almost obsessive to outside observers. SAS operators learned to move at a pace that seemed glacially slow to conventional infantry. Where American infantry might cover 3 or 4 kilometers in an hour, Australian SAS patrols would take 3 hours to cover a single kilometer when operating in enemy territory. Every footfall was carefully placed. Every movement through vegetation was executed with infinite patience. If a vine needed to be moved aside, it was done so slowly that the movement created no sound whatsoever. They modified their equipment in ways that seemed minor but made enormous differences. Dog tags were taped together or removed entirely. Magazines were packed to eliminate any possibility of rounds shifting and creating noise. Weapons were carefully maintained to ensure every moving part operated silently. Even water bottles were wrapped in cloth to prevent the sound of water sloshing. Nothing was allowed to make noise. Nothing was permitted to compromise the silence that kept them alive. But equipment modification was only the beginning. The real transformation happened in the way Australian SAS operators learned to communicate. They developed a system of hand and touch signals so comprehensive and so finely tuned that it amounted to a complete language. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. Pressure on the arm indicated direction. Fingers held in specific configurations conveyed detailed tactical information. Enemy strength, direction of movement, type of forces observed. All of this could be communicated without a single word being spoken. The language of touch. When Roger Hayden accompanied that Australian SAS patrol, one of the first things that struck him was how the patrol leader communicated with his team. There were no verbal commands, no hand signals that involved large, obvious gestures that might be spotted by enemy observers. Instead, the patrol leader used touch. He would reach out and place his hand on a trooper's shoulder. The pressure and duration of that touch conveyed specific meaning that the entire patrol understood instinctively. A brief touch meant stop and observe. Sustained pressure meant danger close, freeze in position. Different patterns of finger pressure on the shoulder indicated different tactical situations. This system had evolved over years of operations. It wasn't something that could be taught in a classroom or learned from a manual. It required time spent together in the field, patrols building a shared vocabulary of sensation and response. An SAS patrol that had worked together for months could communicate with extraordinary precision using nothing but touch. They could coordinate complex tactical movements. They could pass detailed intelligence observations. They could warn each other of threats, all of it conducted in complete silence. The hand signals they did use were deliberately subtle. Where American units might use large, sweeping arm gestures to indicate direction or movement, Australian SAS operators used minimal motions that would be nearly invisible to anyone more than 5 meters away. A slight tilt of the head, a gentle motion of the hand held close to the body, finger positions that conveyed meaning to someone who knew the system but would mean nothing to an outside observer. These weren't the standardized military hand signals taught in training manuals. These were patrol-specific, refined through practice, and extraordinarily effective. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of SAS communication was what happened when patrol members couldn't see each other. In dense jungle or during night operations, visual signals became impossible. That's when the system of touch communication became absolutely critical. SAS operators would move in patrol formation with one hand lightly touching the man in front of them. This physical contact maintained cohesion and allowed for instant communication. If the point man detected something, a specific pattern of squeezes on the shoulder of the man behind him would pass that information down the entire patrol line within seconds, all in complete silence. This level of noise discipline required more than just technique. It required a fundamental shift in psychology. SAS operators had to become comfortable with silence in a way that most people never experience. They had to learn to suppress the natural human urge to fill silence with sound. No nervous chatter, no whispered jokes to break tension, no unnecessary communication of any kind. They learned to exist in their own thoughts for hours at a time, maintaining absolute focus while moving through an environment where the slightest sound could trigger catastrophe. The training for this level of silence discipline was brutal. SAS selection included exercises where candidates were required to patrol in complete silence for extended periods. Any noise resulted in immediate failure, not just obvious noise like talking or equipment rattling, any sound whatsoever. Instructors would observe from concealed positions, listening for the slightest indication that a candidate was making noise. The snap of a twig, the rustle of vegetation, even heavy breathing. Candidates who couldn't maintain perfect silence didn't make it through selection. The Phantom Patrol. Understanding how this silence worked in practice requires examining a specific patrol. The operational details remain classified to this day, but the general outline has emerged through veteran interviews and declassified after-action reports. In early 1968, an Australian SAS patrol was inserted into Vuok Toi province with a mission to locate and observe a suspected Viet Cong battalion headquarters. Intelligence suggested the VC were using a series of cave complexes in the northern mountains as a command center, but American reconnaissance had been unable to confirm this without being detected and driven off. The 5-man SAS patrol was inserted by helicopter at first light, 8 kilometers from their target area. The insertion itself was carefully orchestrated to avoid alerting enemy forces. The helicopter didn't hover or circle over the landing zone. It came in fast and low, touched down just long enough for the patrol to exit, and immediately departed. The entire insertion took less than 30 seconds. Within 2 minutes of hitting the ground, the patrol had vanished into the jungle, leaving no trace of their arrival. They spent the next 18 hours covering those 8 kilometers, 18 hours to travel a distance that conventional infantry would have covered in 2 or 3 hours at most. But this wasn't about speed. It was about remaining completely undetected while moving through territory that the Viet Cong considered their own. The patrol moved with extraordinary caution. The point man would advance a few meters, stop, and observe for several minutes before signaling the next man forward. Each movement was preceded by careful observation. Each footfall was placed with deliberate precision. They moved through Viet Cong territory in broad daylight, passing within meters of enemy positions without being detected. At one point, according to the patrol leader's later account, they spent 45 minutes completely motionless while a VC patrol passed within 15 meters of their position. The enemy fighters were talking among themselves, completely unaware that 5 Australian soldiers were hidden in the vegetation barely a stone's throw away. The SIS patrol remained frozen, controlling their breathing, making no sound whatsoever. When the VC finally moved on, the Australians waited another 30 minutes before resuming movement. Patience and silence had kept them alive. By nightfall on the first day, they were in position overlooking the suspected command complex. They established an observation post in dense vegetation on a hillside that gave them clear sight lines to the cave entrances below, and then they settled in to watch. For the next 6 days, that patrol remained in position, observing enemy movement, counting personnel, identifying patterns, and reporting back to headquarters. 6 days without moving from a position roughly the size of a small bedroom. 6 days of maintaining absolute noise discipline while enemy forces moved past them constantly. The discipline required for this kind of operation is difficult for most people to comprehend. These men couldn't stand up and stretch. They couldn't speak to each other except through the most minimal hand signals. They couldn't make a fire or heat their rations. They ate cold food and drank water that had been treated with iodine tablets that made it taste like chemicals. They urinated and defecated where they sat, doing even this in complete silence. They maintained complete radio silence except for scheduled brief transmissions that lasted no more than 30 seconds. Every night, they took turns on watch while the others slept, but even sleeping had to be done silently. No snoring, no sleep-talking. Men who couldn't control these unconscious sounds didn't make it onto SAS patrols. The level of self-discipline and physical conditioning required to maintain this kind of operation was extraordinary. These weren't superhumans. They were ordinary Australians who had been selected and trained to function at a level that most people would consider impossible. On the 7th day, with their mission complete and valuable intelligence gathered, the patrol began their extraction movement. They moved back through enemy territory using the same painstaking silence that had brought them in. 8 kilometers covered over 2 days, moving so carefully that they left virtually no trace of their passage. When the extraction helicopter finally picked them up, they had been in enemy territory for 9 days. 9 days of perfect silence. 9 days of remaining ghosts. The psychology of silence. What made Australian SAS operators capable of this level of performance? Part of it was selection. The SAS selection process, even in the 1960s, was designed to identify individuals with specific psychological traits: high tolerance for isolation and discomfort, low need for social interaction during operations, above-average ability to maintain focus during extended periods of monotony, the capacity to function effectively while experiencing extreme stress without any outlet for that stress. But selection only identified candidates with the potential. The real transformation happened during training, particularly during the jungle phase of SAS training. Unlike American Special Forces training, which typically lasted around 6 months, Australian SAS training extended for 18 months. A significant portion of that training took place in actual jungle environments, often in places like Papua New Guinea or Northern Australia, where candidates learned to function in the same kind of terrain they would encounter operationally. During this training, candidates learned what might be called predatory patience. This is a concept borrowed from hunting, the ability to remain completely still and alert for extended periods while waiting for the perfect moment to act. A hunter who fidgets or makes noise scares away game. An SAS operator who can't maintain silence gets his patrol killed. The training reinforced this lesson over and over until it became second nature. Silence wasn't something you maintained through conscious effort. It became your default state. They also learned to rewire their relationship with fear and anxiety. In most people, fear triggers nervous behavior, foot tapping, fidgeting, nervous talking. For SAS operators, these responses had to be completely suppressed. They learned to experience fear, acknowledge it, and then set it aside without allowing it to manifest in any physical way. This required extensive psychological conditioning, exercises designed to expose candidates to frightening situations while demanding they maintain perfect composure and silence. The bush skills they developed were equally important. Australian SAS operators learned to read the jungle in ways that seem almost mystical to outsiders. They could determine safe paths through vegetation by observing how animals moved. They understood which surfaces would make noise underfoot and which could be traversed silently. They learned to use natural sounds to mask their own movement. When wind rustled vegetation, that was the moment to move. When rain created background noise, that was the time to advance. They became part of the environment rather than intruders in it. This deep understanding of the jungle environment allowed them to predict how sound would behave. They knew that valleys and draws channeled sound in specific ways. They understood that certain atmospheric conditions carried voices further than others. They could estimate with reasonable accuracy how far a specific sound would travel under current conditions. This knowledge informed every decision about when to move, when to communicate, and when to maintain absolute stillness. The contrast with American methods. The difference between Australian and American approaches to jungle operations in Vietnam was stark. American doctrine, shaped by experiences in World War II and Korea, emphasized firepower and mobility. The standard American infantry platoon in Vietnam operated with around 30 to 40 men. They moved in formations designed for mutual support and maximum firepower. They stayed in constant radio contact with higher command. They called in artillery and air support at the first sign of enemy contact. This was a valid approach for conventional warfare against a conventional enemy. But in the Vietnamese jungle against an enemy that had mastered the art of appearing and disappearing at will, this approach had serious limitations. Large formations made noise. Constant radio communication created detectable electronic signatures. The reliance on supporting fires meant American units needed to operate within range of their bases, limiting their operational reach. And the emphasis on quick, decisive engagement meant that American patrols often missed detecting enemy forces entirely because they were moving too fast and making too much noise to notice the subtle signs of enemy presence. American Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Units, or LRRPs, came closer to the Australian model. These were smaller teams, usually 5 to 6 men, who operated deep in enemy territory, gathering intelligence. They understood the value of stealth and employed many noise-discipline techniques. But even LRRP operated under different constraints than Australian SAS. American doctrine required regular radio checks. LRRP teams were expected to report in at scheduled intervals, which meant they had to transmit even when doing so might compromise their position. Australian SAS patrols, by contrast, maintained radio silence for days at a time, transmitting only when absolutely necessary. The equipment differences also mattered. American soldiers in Vietnam carried significantly more gear than their Australian counterparts. More ammunition, more grenades, more specialized equipment. All of this weight meant more noise when moving. The Australian philosophy was to travel light and rely on skill rather than firepower. An SAS patrol might carry only what they could use if contact was made. The rest was stripped away to reduce weight and eliminate anything that might make noise. Training differences were equally significant. American soldiers typically received 13 weeks of basic training, followed by advanced individual training in their specific military occupational specialty. Even elite units like the Rangers or Special Forces received training measured in months. Australian SAS training, as mentioned earlier, lasted 18 months and was specifically focused on the kind of operations they would conduct in Southeast Asia. This extended training period allowed for the development of skills that simply can't be taught quickly. Moving silently through jungle isn't something you learn in a few weeks. It takes months of practice to internalize the techniques until they become automatic. Perhaps most importantly, the Australian approach was built on a different operational philosophy. American forces measured success in body counts and territory controlled. Australian forces measured success in intelligence gathered and enemy capabilities degraded. This meant Australian SAS patrols were comfortable spending days, or even weeks, observing without engaging. American patrols, under pressure to produce results measured in enemy killed, often felt compelled to engage even when tactical conditions weren't favorable. The pressure to produce measurable results often conflicted with the patience required for truly effective reconnaissance. The ultimate test, Operation Coburg. In January 1968, Australian and New Zealand forces participated in Operation Coburg, one of the largest Allied operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. While the main force elements conducted search and destroy missions, Australian SAS patrols were tasked with providing deep reconnaissance and intelligence on enemy movements. What happened during these patrols demonstrated just how effective perfect silence could be in combat operations. One particular patrol, designated 2-4, inserted into an area north of the Longhai Mountains where intelligence suggested significant enemy forces were operating. The patrol's mission was to locate enemy base camps and report on troop movements without being detected. For 14 days, this 5-man patrol operated deep in enemy territory, moving with such stealth that they were able to observe Viet Cong forces at extremely close range without ever being detected. On the 5th day of the operation, the patrol detected movement in heavy jungle ahead of their position. Moving with extraordinary caution, they closed to within 30 meters of what turned out to be a Viet Cong company, roughly 120 men, setting up a temporary camp. The SAS patrol found a position in dense vegetation overlooking the camp and settled in to observe. For the next 16 hours, they watched enemy forces from a distance where they could hear conversations, see individual faces, observe every detail of the enemy camp routine. The Viet Cong soldiers had no idea they were being watched. They moved about their camp with the casual confidence of men who believed they were in safe territory. They cooked meals, they cleaned weapons, they conducted training exercises, and 30 meters away, 5 Australian soldiers observed everything, counted every man, noted every weapon, identified the unit and its commanders, and relayed all of this information back to headquarters through brief, whispered radio transmissions that took only seconds. At one point, according to the patrol leader's later account, a Viet Cong soldier walked within 3 meters of the patrol's position while looking for a place to relieve himself. The Australian operators remained absolutely motionless as the enemy fighter stood there, completely unaware of their presence. After he finished and walked back to the camp, the patrol remained frozen for another 20 minutes before allowing themselves to relax slightly. Even then, they maintained perfect silence. The intelligence gathered during this observation led to a highly successful ambush operation by conventional forces several days later. But more importantly, it demonstrated something that contradicted American tactical assumptions. The Viet Cong were not supernaturally good at detecting enemy presence. They could be approached, observed, and evaded just like any other military force. The key was moving with enough stealth that you never gave them anything to detect. Sound discipline was the foundation of that stealth. The legacy of silence. The Australian SAS approach to silence in Vietnam left a lasting impact on special operations doctrine worldwide. In the years following Vietnam, military forces around the globe began studying Australian methods and attempting to incorporate them into their own training programs. The U.S. military, in particular, spent considerable effort trying to understand and replicate what the Australians had accomplished, but replication proved difficult. The Australian success with silence wasn't just about techniques or training methods. It was rooted in a military culture that valued patience over aggression, intelligence over firepower, and skill over technology. These cultural values couldn't be easily transplanted into military organizations built on different foundations. American Special Operations Forces adopted many of the specific techniques. They improved their noise discipline. They reduced radio transmissions. They learned to move more carefully through jungle terrain. Yet something was lost in translation. The level of silence that Australian SAS operators routinely achieved remained elusive for most other forces. Part of this was about time and resources. The 18-month training cycle that produced SAS operators couldn't be replicated in military organizations that needed to produce special operators more quickly. Part of it was about selection. The psychological profile that made someone suitable for this kind of warfare was relatively rare, and identifying those individuals required selection processes that many militaries found too stringent. But perhaps the most significant factor was philosophical. The Australian approach required accepting that sometimes the best action was no action. That observation without engagement could be more valuable than a firefight with questionable results. That spending weeks gathering intelligence on an enemy position was more important than assaulting that position immediately. This kind of patience ran counter to the action-oriented culture of most military organizations. Modern special operations forces have internalized many of these lessons. Units like the U.S. Army's Delta Force and the Navy's SEAL Team 6 employ noise discipline techniques that would have been recognizable to Australian SAS operators in Vietnam. Silence has become a fundamental component of special operations tradecraft. But even today, achieving the level of perfect silence that the Australian SAS maintained for days or weeks at a time remains an extraordinary achievement. The technology available to modern special operators both helps and hinders in this regard. Advanced communication systems allow for silent digital transmissions that are far more secure than the radio equipment available in Vietnam. Night vision technology reduces the need for certain kinds of noisy movement, but this same technology can become a crutch. Operators who rely on technology to solve problems sometimes lose the fundamental skills that the Australians developed through necessity. Moving silently through jungle terrain requires physical skill and environmental awareness that no technology can replace. The broader implications. The Australian SAS experience in Vietnam offers lessons that extend beyond military tactics. At its core, their success with silence was about understanding and accepting the nature of their operational environment. They recognized that the jungle favored stealth over force, patience over speed, observation over action. They adapted their methods to work with these realities rather than against them. This stands in contrast to the broader American approach in Vietnam, which often seemed to involve trying to reshape the environment to fit preferred methods of warfare. Defoliants to eliminate jungle cover, massive firepower to compensate for limited visibility, large formations to provide security when smaller units would have been more appropriate. None of these approaches were necessarily wrong, but they represented a different philosophy. Change the environment to suit your strengths rather than changing your methods to suit the environment. The SAS approach required humility. It required accepting that sometimes the enemy's home terrain gave them advantages that couldn't be overcome through technology or firepower. It required learning from that enemy and developing methods specifically suited to that particular environment and that particular conflict. This kind of adaptation is difficult for large military organizations built on standardized doctrine and established procedures. It also required trust in individual judgment and skill at a level that many military organizations find uncomfortable. SAS patrols operated for weeks at a time, with minimal oversight and enormous autonomy. Patrol leaders made tactical decisions without requesting permission or guidance from higher command. This worked because those patrol leaders were extraordinarily well-trained and carefully selected, but it required senior commanders to accept that they couldn't micromanage operations or demand immediate results. The human cost. The silence that made Australian SAS operators so effective came with costs that weren't always visible. The psychological impact of spending weeks in enemy territory, maintaining perfect silence while under constant threat, left marks on many operators that didn't heal quickly. Unlike conventional infantry, who might spend days in the field before returning to base, SAS operators sometimes remained on patrol for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. The isolation and stress of these operations affected men differently. Some operators thrived on it. They were the kind of people who were most comfortable in exactly those situations. The silence didn't bother them. The isolation was something they embraced. For others, the psychological toll accumulated over time, the constant vigilance required to maintain perfect noise discipline for extended periods created stress that manifested in various ways after operations ended. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans, including SAS personnel, were significant. Part of this stemmed from the nature of the operations they conducted. Spending days observing enemy forces from extremely close range, unable to make any sound, created a form of stress that was different from but no less intense than direct combat. The need to remain completely silent even when frightened or uncomfortable required suppressing natural human responses in ways that left psychological scars. The skills that made operators effective in the field sometimes made readjustment to civilian life difficult. Men who had learned to be comfortable with extended periods of silence in threatening environments sometimes struggled with normal social interaction. The hypervigilance necessary for survival in enemy territory didn't switch off easily when they returned home. The ability to detect slight sounds and assess them for threats became a burden in civilian environments where every sound required conscious effort to dismiss as non-threatening. Yet many veterans speak of their time with the SAS as the most meaningful period of their lives. The bonds formed during those silent patrols, the shared experience of operating at such a high level under extreme stress, created connections that lasted lifetimes. The satisfaction of knowing they had mastered one of the most difficult forms of warfare, that they had achieved things that most people would consider impossible, gave many veterans a sense of accomplishment that civilian life struggled to match. Lessons for today. More than 5 decades after Australian SAS operators were moving through Vietnamese jungles in perfect silence, their methods remain relevant. Modern special operations forces still study those Vietnam-era patrols, still try to understand what made them so extraordinarily effective. The specific techniques have evolved, the technology has changed dramatically, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. In warfare, particularly the kind of unconventional warfare that dominates modern conflicts, silence remains one of the most powerful weapons available. Silence creates uncertainty in the enemy. When they can't hear you, they don't know where you are, how many you are, or what you're capable of. This uncertainty forces them to operate defensively, to second-guess their assumptions, to fear unseen threats. The psychological impact of facing an enemy you cannot detect is profound. It erodes confidence, creates paranoia, and degrades combat effectiveness more surely than direct attack. Silence also creates opportunities that noise eliminates. An enemy who doesn't know you're there reveals information they would never expose to a known threat. They move freely, communicate openly, follow predictable patterns. All of this intelligence becomes available to an observer who can remain undetected. This intelligence advantage, properly exploited, can achieve results far beyond what direct combat could accomplish. But perhaps most importantly, silence reflects a deeper truth about effective warfare. Success doesn't always come from doing more. Sometimes it comes from doing less, but doing it perfectly. The Australian SAS operators in Vietnam understood that 5 men moving in perfect silence through enemy territory could accomplish more than a company of conventional infantry announcing their presence with every step. This insight, this willingness to trust in skill and patience over firepower and speed, represents a kind of strategic wisdom that remains valuable today. Modern military conflicts, particularly counterinsurgency operations and special operations missions often require exactly the kind of patient, silent observation that the Australian SAS perfected in Vietnam. The ability to move through hostile territory undetected, to observe enemy forces without being compromised, to gather intelligence that provides decisive advantage. These capabilities remain as valuable now as they were in 1968. Yet achieving this level of proficiency requires commitments that not all military organizations are willing to make. Extended training periods, rigorous selection processes that eliminate most candidates, cultural changes that value patience and skill over aggressive action. These requirements haven't changed since Vietnam. The Australian SAS succeeded because they were willing to make these commitments and accept the costs that came with them. The final silence. There's a story that Australian SAS veterans sometimes tell, though it's difficult to verify and may be apocryphal. During one of the last SAS patrols in Vietnam, before Australian forces began their withdrawal, a 5-man patrol inserted deep into enemy territory for what was supposed to be a 2-week reconnaissance mission. On the 3rd day of the patrol, while observing a large Viet Cong encampment, one of the operators developed a severe respiratory infection. Within hours, he was fighting to suppress coughs that threatened to compromise the entire patrol's position. Under standard doctrine, the patrol should have called for extraction. An operator who couldn't maintain silence endangered everyone. But extraction would have meant abandoning the mission and losing valuable intelligence on enemy forces preparing for a major operation. The patrol leader made a decision. They would continue the mission, but the sick operator would be constantly monitored, and at the first sign that his coughing might give away their position, they would extract. For the next 11 days, that patrol remained in position while one of their operators fought a worsening illness. His teammates took turns staying close to him, ready to muffle any sound with their hands if necessary. They monitored his condition constantly, prepared to call for extraction the moment it became necessary. And somehow, despite his illness, despite the discomfort and the fear, that operator maintained discipline. When he felt a cough coming, he would bury his face in a cloth soaked with water and breathe through it, suppressing the sound. When he needed to move, he did so with even more care than usual, knowing his condition made him a liability. The patrol completed their mission. They gathered critical intelligence that led to the disruption of a planned enemy offensive, and they extracted without ever being detected. The sick operator was evacuated to medical care and eventually recovered. But what veterans remember about that story isn't the intelligence gathered or the enemy operation disrupted. What they remember is one man's absolute commitment to maintaining silence even while seriously ill, and 4 teammates' willingness to accept enormous risk to give him the chance to prove himself capable of that commitment. Whether or not this specific story is true, it represents something real about the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam. These weren't men who treated silence as a tactic to be employed when convenient. For them, silence was a way of being, a fundamental commitment that defined how they operated in the world. It was what separated them from conventional soldiers and made them the most feared enemy force in the Vietnamese jungle. That commitment to silence, to patience, to doing things properly rather than quickly, created results that spoke louder than any amount of noise ever could. Over their years operating in Vietnam, Australian SAS patrols killed or captured hundreds of enemy fighters while suffering remarkably few casualties themselves. More importantly, They gathered intelligence that shaped operations across the theater. They disrupted enemy plans, degraded enemy capabilities, and created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that reduced enemy effectiveness far beyond the immediate tactical impact of their operations. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, because that's genuinely what they seemed to be. An enemy that appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished without leaving a trace. An enemy that could observe you from meters away without your knowledge. An enemy that moved through your territory like smoke through air, impossible to grasp or predict. The psychological impact of facing such an enemy cannot be overstated, and at the foundation of everything that made them effective was silence, not complicated technology, not overwhelming firepower, not superior numbers, just 5 men who had learned to move through hostile jungle in perfect silence, who had the patience to wait for exactly the right moment, and who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just watch and wait, and remain absolutely silent until the moment comes to act. If you can hear them, you're already dead. That wasn't just a saying. It was the reality of facing the Australian SAS in Vietnam. By the time you heard them, if you ever did, it meant they wanted you to hear them. And that meant their silent observation was complete, their intelligence gathering was finished, and now they were transitioning to the loud part, the part where all that patient, silent work paid off in violence so sudden and overwhelming that the enemy had no chance to respond. The legacy of those silent patrols continues today. Every time a special operations team moves through hostile territory in perfect noise discipline, they're employing lessons learned in Vietnamese jungles more than 50 years ago. Every time an operator chooses patience over action, observation over engagement, they're channeling the spirit of those Australian SAS phantoms. The specific techniques have evolved, but the fundamental insight remains unchanged. In warfare, silence isn't weakness, it's power. And those who master it become something more than soldiers. They become ghosts,